When Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA enforcer, took it upon herself to crack down on parking violations by slapping boot locks on every offending car, she believed she was upholding order in the community. But when residents realized her actions weren't just excessive, but downright illegal, their once peaceful suburban street erupted into a storm of lawsuits, revenge schemes, and a viral Reddit thread that put her entitlement on full display for the world to witness. Karen had always been the kind of person who thrived on control. In her mind, the world was a chaotic place, and it was her duty to bring order to it, starting with her neighborhood. She had lived in the quiet suburban community for over a decade, and in that time, she had slowly but surely carved out a role for herself as the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, HOA rules. To her, the HOA wasn't just a governing body. It was a sacred institution, and she was its most devoted disciple. Her obsession with rules began innocently enough. At first, it was small things, reminding neighbors to bring in their trash bins by sunset, or gently chiding someone for letting their grass grow a little too long. But over time, her reminders turned into warnings, and her warnings turned into threats. Karen had a way of making even the most minor infraction feel like a personal affront. She would patrol the streets in her pristine white SUV, her eyes scanning for any sign of disorder. A misplaced garden gnome, a car parked slightly over the line, a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige. Nothing escaped her notice. Karen's neighbors tolerated her at first, chalking up her behavior to harmless eccentricity. But as the years went by, her meddling became harder to ignore. She began filing formal complaints with the HOA board, often over trivial matters. A child's bicycle left on a driveway overnight? Complaint. A Halloween decoration deemed too gory? Complaint. A dog barking for more than 5 minutes? Complaint. The board, tired of her constant nagging, eventually gave her a seat at the table, hoping it would placate her. It didn't. If anything, it only emboldened her. With her new position, Karen's sense of authority grew exponentially. She started hosting monthly neighborhood watch meetings, though they were less about safety and more about her lecturing residents on the importance of adhering to HOA guidelines. She even created a newsletter filled with passive-aggressive reminders and thinly veiled threats about the consequences of breaking the rules. Her neighbors began to dread seeing her name in their inboxes or hearing her voice on the phone. To them, she wasn't just an HOA board member. She was a tyrant in a cardigan. The final straw came when parking violations began to spike. The neighborhood had always had a few parking issues: cars blocking driveways, oversized vehicles parked overnight, visitors taking up resident spots. But Karen saw it as a full-blown crisis. She started documenting every infraction, taking photos and jotting down license plate numbers. She even set up a makeshift parking violation log in her garage, complete with color-coded tabs and highlighted entries. When the HOA board suggested hiring a professional towing service to handle the problem, Karen scoffed. "Why waste money when I can handle it myself?" she said. And handle it she did. One day, while browsing online, Karen stumbled upon a website selling boot locks, the kind used by law enforcement to immobilize vehicles. A light bulb went off in her head. If she could boot the cars of rule breakers, she could teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. Without consulting the board or checking local laws, she ordered a dozen boot locks and waited for them to arrive. When the package finally came, she felt a rush of excitement. This was her chance to show the neighborhood who was really in charge. Little did she know, her actions would set off a chain of events that would turn her quiet suburban life upside down. Karen had always believed that rules were meant to be followed, no matter the cost. But as she was about to discover, there was one rule she had overlooked: the law. And breaking that one would come with consequences she could never have imagined. The first booting happened on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of day that felt deceptively peaceful. Karen had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to test her new boot locks, and it didn't take long for one to present itself. A silver sedan was parked slightly over the line in a shared driveway, its rear bumper encroaching just a few inches into the neighboring space. To anyone else, it was a minor oversight, barely worth noticing. But to Karen, it was an egregious violation of the sacred parking rules she had worked so hard to enforce. She parked her white SUV a few houses down, watching the car like a hawk. She wanted to make sure the owner wasn't nearby before she made her move. After a few minutes of surveillance, she grabbed one of the boot locks from her trunk and marched over to the offending vehicle. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and self-righteous indignation as she knelt down and clamped the boot onto the front tire. The metallic click of the lock snapping into place was music to her ears. She stood back, admiring her handiwork, and then placed a neon orange notice on the windshield. It read, "Parking violation. Follow the rules or face the consequences. HOA enforcement." The owner of the car, a young single mom named Lisa, discovered the boot an hour later as she rushed to get her kids to school. She had been running late that morning, juggling breakfast, backpacks, and a last-minute permission slip, and the sight of the boot stopped her in her tracks. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She checked the notice, her confusion turning to anger as she read Karen's terse message. "What the hell?" she muttered, glancing around as if the person responsible might still be nearby. Her kids, sensing her frustration, started to whine from the back seat. "Mom, we're going to be late," her oldest daughter complained. Lisa tried calling the number on the notice, but it went straight to voicemail. She didn't have time to deal with this. She had to get her kids to school and herself to work. Desperate, she called a tow truck, only to be told that removing a boot lock without proper authorization could result in fines or legal action. Frustrated and on the verge of tears, Lisa ended up calling a rideshare to take her kids to school and herself to work. The whole ordeal cost her nearly $100 in rides and lost wages, not to mention the stress of explaining the situation to her boss. Word of the booting spread quickly through the neighborhood. By that evening, the community Facebook group was buzzing with outrage. "Did anyone else get booted today?" one post read. "I came home to find this thing on my tire and no way to get it off." Another complained. Photos of the boot locks and Karen's notices flooded the group, along with speculation about who was behind it. It didn't take long for someone to connect the dots. "It's Karen," one neighbor wrote. "I saw her out this morning with some kind of tool. She's lost her mind." Karen, meanwhile, was feeling triumphant. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and scrolling through the Facebook group with a satisfied smile. The complaints only reinforced her belief that she was doing the right thing. "They'll learn," she muttered to herself. "They'll all learn." Over the next few days, she continued her booting campaign, targeting any car she deemed in violation of the rules. A pickup truck parked too close to a fire hydrant? Booted. A visitor's car parked in a residence spot? Booted. A minivan with an expired registration sticker? Booted. But as the number of booted cars grew, so did the backlash. Neighbors began to confront Karen directly, demanding she remove the locks and stop harassing them. She refused, citing her authority as an HOA board member. "If you don't like it, follow the rules," she snapped at one angry resident. What Karen didn't realize was that her actions were about to spark a firestorm, one that would burn far hotter than she ever anticipated. The neighborhood's initial shock over the boot locks quickly turned to fury. What had started as a few isolated complaints in the community Facebook group soon escalated into a full-blown uprising. Residents who had once rolled their eyes at Karen's antics were now united in their anger. The booting wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a violation of their rights, and they weren't going to let it slide. Lisa, the single mom whose car had been the first to be booted, became the de facto leader of the resistance. She created a private chat group for affected neighbors, and within hours, it was flooded with stories of Karen's overreach. One man shared how he'd been booted while dropping off groceries for his elderly mother. A college student posted photos of her booted car, explaining that she'd been late to an exam because of it. Even the local mail carrier chimed in, revealing that Karen had tried to boot her postal van for blocking the street. The more people shared, the clearer it became. Karen had gone too far. Determined to fight back, Lisa and a few others decided to do some research. A quick Google search revealed that booting vehicles was heavily regulated. Only law enforcement or licensed professionals could legally install and remove boot locks. Karen, as a private citizen and HOA board member, had no such authority. Armed with this information, Lisa called a meeting at her house to discuss their next steps. Over coffee and cookies, the group drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, demanding that Karen be removed from her position and that all boot locks be immediately removed. The HOA board, already feeling the heat from angry residents, held an emergency meeting to address the situation. Karen, however, was unrepentant. "I'm just enforcing the rules," she insisted during the meeting. "If people don't like it, maybe they should park properly." Her tone was dismissive, as if the growing backlash was nothing more than a minor annoyance. The other board members, though, were less confident. They knew Karen's actions had put the entire HOA at risk of legal action, and they weren't willing to take the fall for her. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's anger continued to simmer. Some residents took matters into their own hands, organizing a boot watch to catch Karen in the act. Others began documenting every interaction with her, taking photos and videos to build a case against her. One particularly tech-savvy neighbor even set up a security camera pointed at the street, hoping to catch her installing a boot lock. The sense of camaraderie was palpable. Karen's actions had brought the community together, albeit in opposition to her. The tension reached a boiling point when a local news crew showed up to cover the story. A reporter, tipped off by a resident, interviewed Lisa and several others about their experiences. Karen, ever the control freak, tried to intervene, demanding that the crew leave the neighborhood immediately. But her attempts to intimidate them only made for better TV. That evening, the segment aired, painting Karen as the villain and the neighborhood as the victim. The story went viral, with viewers across the country weighing in on social media. Karen's name became synonymous with HOA overreach, and the once quiet suburban street became the center of a national debate. As the pressure mounted, Karen began to crack. She started avoiding her neighbors, retreating into her house, and only emerging to patrol the streets under the cover of darkness. But even then, she wasn't safe from scrutiny. One night, as she attempted to boot another car, a group of residents confronted her, filming the encounter on their phones. "You can't do this," one shouted. "It's illegal." Karen, flustered and outnumbered, retreated to her SUV and sped off, leaving the boot lock behind. The incident marked a turning point. The next day, the HOA board issued a public statement condemning Karen's actions and announcing that all boot locks would be removed immediately. They also promised to review the neighborhood's parking policies and establish clearer guidelines for enforcement. For Karen, it was a humiliating defeat, one that would have far-reaching consequences. But for the rest of the neighborhood, it was a hard-fought victory. They had stood up to a bully and won, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their community. The first lawsuit hit Karen like a freight train. Lisa, the single mom whose car had been the first to be booted, had had enough. She hired a lawyer, and together they filed a civil suit against Karen and the HOA for legal booting, emotional distress, and financial damages. The lawsuit was a wake-up call for everyone involved. Karen, who had always believed herself untouchable, suddenly found herself facing the very real possibility of losing everything. The lawsuit detailed the ordeal Lisa had endured, the missed work hours, the cost of ride shares, the stress of explaining the situation to her boss. It also highlighted the broader pattern of Karen's behavior, citing multiple instances of her overstepping her authority. The HOA board, named as a co-defendant, scrambled to distance themselves from Karen. They issued a public statement reiterating that her actions were not authorized and that they had no knowledge of her booting campaign. But it was too late. The damage had been done. As the lawsuit made its way through the legal system, more residents came forward with their own stories. A retired couple revealed that they had been booted while visiting their grandkids, resulting in hundreds of dollars in towing fees. A college student shared how being booted had caused her to miss a crucial exam, jeopardizing her scholarship. Even the mail carrier, whose van Karen had tried to boot, joined the lawsuit, citing harassment and interference with her duties. The case quickly grew into a class action suit, with dozens of plaintiffs seeking compensation for their losses. Karen, meanwhile, was in over her head. She had never expected her booting campaign to blow up like this. She had assumed that her neighbors would grumble, but ultimately fall in line, as they always had. Instead, they were fighting back. and winning. Her once unshakable confidence began to crumble under the weight of legal fees and public scrutiny. She tried to defend herself, insisting that she had only been trying to enforce the rules, but her excuses fell on deaf ears. Even her closest allies on the HOA board turned their backs on her, unwilling to risk their own reputations. The media frenzy only made things worse. News outlets, always eager for a juicy story, latched onto the case with gusto. Karen became the face of HOA overreach, her name synonymous with entitlement and abuse of power. Memes mocking her circulated on social media, and late-night comedians used her as a punchline. The attention was relentless, and Karen found herself increasingly isolated. Her neighbors, once willing to tolerate her eccentricities, now avoided her like the plague. Even her family seemed embarrassed by her actions, with her adult children refusing to return her calls. The final blow came when the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. Karen was ordered to pay thousands of dollars in damages, a sum that far exceeded her savings. The HOA, though partially vindicated by their efforts to distance themselves from Karen, was also held liable for failing to rein her in. Their insurance refused to cover the damages, leaving the board scrambling to find the funds. In the end, they were forced to raise HOA fees, a move that only deepened the community's resentment. For Karen, the lawsuit was a humiliating defeat. She was forced to sell her house to cover the legal fees and damages, leaving the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. As she packed up her belongings, she couldn't help but feel a sense of bitterness. She had only been trying to do what was best for the community, she told herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had let her need for control consume her, and now she was paying the price. The neighborhood, meanwhile, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Karen's departure marked the end of a dark chapter in their history, and they were determined to move forward. The HOA board implemented new policies to prevent future abuses of power, and the residents, united by their shared ordeal, worked to rebuild the sense of community that Karen had shattered. It wasn't easy, but they were determined to create a neighborhood where everyone felt welcome, a place where rules were enforced fairly, and no one person could ever wield that much power again. The story of Karen and the bootlocks didn't end with her departure from the neighborhood. In fact, it was just the beginning of her infamy. One of the residents, a tech-savvy young man named Jake, decided to share the entire saga on Reddit. He posted a detailed account of Karen's reign of terror, complete with photos of the bootlocks, screenshots of her passive-aggressive notes, and links to the news coverage. He titled the post, HOA Karen installs bootlocks on every car, didn't know it's illegal, and submitted it to the EntitledPeople subreddit. Within hours, the post went viral. Redditors from around the world flocked to the thread, sharing their own stories of HOA nightmares and cheering on the neighborhood for standing up to Karen. The comments section became a mix of outrage, humor, and solidarity. "This is peak Karen behavior," one user wrote. "I hope she gets what's coming to her," added another. Memes and jokes about Karen flooded the thread, with users dubbing her Bootlock Karen and creating parody accounts in her name. The post quickly became one of the most upvoted stories in the subreddit's history, cementing Karen's status as an internet legend. The viral post caught the attention of mainstream media, and soon, Karen's story was everywhere. News outlets picked up the Reddit thread, turning it into headlines like HOA Karen's Bootlock Backfire and the rise and fall of Bootlock Karen. Late-night talk shows featured segments mocking her, and YouTube creators made videos dissecting the saga. Karen, who had once craved control and attention, found herself at the center of a media storm she couldn't escape. Her face, captured in photos from the neighborhood Facebook group, became instantly recognizable, a symbol of entitlement gone wrong. Back in the neighborhood, the residents watched the chaos unfold with a mix of amusement and relief. Jake's Reddit post had not only exposed Karen to the world, but also brought the community closer together. They held a block party to celebrate their victory, complete with a bootlock piñata that kids took turns smashing. The event felt like a cathartic release, a way to put the ordeal behind them and move forward. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a true community, united by their shared experience and determination to prevent anything like this from happening again. Karen, meanwhile, was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the neighborhood she had once ruled. The media attention had taken a toll on her, and she found herself increasingly isolated. Her adult children, embarrassed by the scandal, had cut off contact, and her former friends wanted nothing to do with her. She spent her days scrolling through the endless stream of articles and social media posts about her, each one a painful reminder of her downfall. The once proud HOA enforcer was now a cautionary tale, a living example of what happens when entitlement goes unchecked. As the months passed, the neighborhood continued to heal. The HOA board implemented new policies to ensure transparency and accountability, and residents worked together to create a more inclusive and welcoming community. Karen's name was rarely mentioned, but her legacy lingered, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for what's right. For Karen, there was no happy ending. She had lost her home, her reputation, and the respect of everyone who had once known her. But in a strange way, her story served a purpose. It became a rallying cry for people everywhere who had suffered under the tyranny of entitled individuals, a reminder that no one is above the rules. And while Karen herself faded into obscurity, her story lived on, a viral sensation that would be told and retold for years to come. In the end, Karen had wanted to be remembered as the enforcer who brought order to her neighborhood. Instead, she became the villain in a story of community resilience, a lesson in what happens when one person's need for control goes too far. And for the residents who had stood up to her, that was a victory worth celebrating.